So I'm going to introduce Michele Fahy, who either will be known to many of you or her writing, her splendid work will be known to you, I'm fairly sure. Michele is a writer, and for the earlier part of her professional life, she wrote, actually, this might surprise you, but she wrote for corporate publications in the financial world and made a living that way, writing for financial bodies. And then about 2008, saw the light as she saw it and decided to do something different. I won't value judge that, but something different. So now Michele is an independent researcher, and she's been involved in research and campaigning with a number of organisations in Australia, organisations working for peace. Her particular interest at the moment is the prevention of corruption via increased transparency and accountability, and particularly relating this at the moment to the revolving door between the military defence establishment and government. So that's where Michele is. We're all very grateful for this. Michele is focusing her efforts now. Her work has appeared in a number of publications, number of fairly prominent ones, and she publishes her work via her Substack website at the moment. So we're really delighted to have you here, Michele, to speak with us about the issue of state capture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue, for that lovely introduction. Hello, everybody. I was born on Gadigal country in the Eora Nation, and now I live here in Ngunnawal Ngambri country. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the past and present elders of the traditional owners of this land. I would also like to thank very much IPAN for your valuable work here. It's been a very interesting conference, and also for inviting me to speak today. Sue is correct. My stories do end up being about two things: transparency and accountability, or more accurately in this industry, the lack thereof. And it's just two passions of mine that I can't let go of. Today, I'm going to give you a snapshot of the intersection between the arms industry and the Australian government, the power and the influence of it on one hand, and the secrecy and lack of accountability on the other hand. It's hard to do this simply in a short space of time. It's a very vast area. So what I've done is chosen a particular example, which we can go through in a bit of detail, which, as far as the work I've done so far, covers off so many of the problems and areas that are a concern. So it's going to be kind of like a case study. That's to sort of shine a spotlight on the undue influence of this industry in the light of state capture. It's by no means the only example, but it's a really good one for illustrating how the industry can manipulate and control government decision-making to undermine the public interest and serve its own private interests. And we know a fair bit about this case study thanks to the Australian National Audit Office, so I want to give them a plug. Seriously underfunded, fantastic organisation. Phil, I'll have that next slide, Phil. So state capture, this undermining of public interest to serve private interests, when it becomes entrenched, don't worry if it's a bit pale, I'll read it out. It's called state capture, the undermining of the public interest to serve private interests. The World Bank describes it like this: it's the exercise of power by private actors through control over resources, threats of violence, or other forms of influence to shape policies or implementation in service of their own narrow interest. So that's how the World Bank defines state capture. And that's the context in which we'll be having this conversation. First, I want to give a few figures just to show you. I'm sure this is a highly educated audience on this part, so I'll race through this. You probably all know, but I just wanted to, I'll do the next slide too, Phil, show you how the arms industry here fits in globally. You don't need to read the names on the chart, so don't worry about that. The point I'm making is the number of those names that are in red. At the left is a list of the top 15 global arms manufacturers, and at the right is a list of the top 15 contractors to defence in Australia. The names I've put in red are those that appear in both lists. So you can see there's quite a large number. There's a large amount of crossover. So this is not at all surprising, and I'm sure not to any of you, but I think it's useful to get a visual sense of the degree of foreign arms manufacturer influence that exists here in Australia. 11 of the top 15 Australian defence contractors are foreign owned. They're the right side, the red ones. If we take out the 3 Australian companies in that top 15 Australian list on the right that are not arms manufacturers, so 3 of the 4 Australian ones aren't arms manufacturers, they supply services to defence for the bases, maintaining, expanding the bases, catering, that kind of thing. That will leave one company, which is ASC, which used to be called Australian Submarine Corporation. It's in South Australia. So there's one Australian arms manufacturer on that list, and all the rest are foreign ones. The left column just shows where those rank in world rankings. So all of them are pretty much in the top 40, except for KBR, but and 2/3 of them are in the top 15. So the point I'm making and why I've picked the 15 is that ASPI did a study in 2017 that found that on average in the last 20 years, the top 15 contractors took 91% of the revenue. So when you look at that list, that's a really large chunk that just goes offshore. So that's the point of putting that there. Along with that quick little snapshot, I found, some of you will know about SIPRI. SIPRI is a Swedish organisation that looks at arms industry expenditure and arms sales, and it does fantastic research. So give them a plug as well, SIPRI. They're worth looking at if you're into research. They did a report called Mapping the International Presence of the World's Largest Arms Companies in 2020. It took the world's top 15 arms manufacturers as well and systematically investigated how many subsidiaries and joint ventures those 15 companies had dotted around the globe. To be included, the subsidiaries had to be actually involved in arms production and military services. So they're not shell companies or just glossy shop fronts for lobbying. They're actual production entities. And what SIPRI found was 400 subsidiaries around the globe of these 15 companies, spread across at least 49 countries. They're mostly in countries that have 2 features. First, that the country is a large arms importer, and the second is that it's also trying to establish a local arms industry. So that makes complete sense, right? Obviously, in that sort of scenario, you can see why a foreign arms maker would be moving into that country. And you can guess this too, Australia is one such country. So we're a very big arms importer. That hardly ever gets discussed here, but we're the 4th largest in the world currently. We're one of America's biggest clients. In the 5 years to 2020, Australia was actually the United States' 2nd largest arms customer, behind Saudi Arabia. Even before that, for years, we've been a top 5 customer of the USA arms industry. So it's worth bearing in mind, as people have said earlier, when US calls us its very good friend, that we are indeed very lucrative good friend. We're also, Australia is also BAE Systems, that's the UK's largest arms maker. We're BAE's 4th largest market. When the Turnbull government announced its massive planned spend on weaponry, I just want to give you this quote. BAE's Director of International Markets said at the time in 2017, this is the quote, "We are really in exciting times in the Australian market. The government procurement plans are hugely ambitious. There aren't too many countries who have that scale of defence procurement ambition in the next 15 years. So, and that was before AUKUS came along. So you can imagine what's happening now. So that just gives you some context of the amount of power and influence that is here now. The summary from that CIPRI report that's interesting is Australia's now, the two big weapons making hubs in the world are North America and Western Europe. Australia now ranks third after them and for the number as a manufacturing hub. Also, in that report, which I just found fascinating, we rank second in the world for the number of those subsidiaries that we host here. So it's 38 that we have here. The UK was first with 56, and Saudi Arabia is third with 24. That's out of those 400 entities. So we're we're hugely influenced here by the global arms industry, the topmost echelons of it. So that was the point of those slides and that CIPRI, just to give you that sense of how the platform is here for undue influence in a big way. So what I'll do now is put the next slide, Phil. It's just a photo. That's the Thales Hawkeye. People here might call it Thales, and that's how you would say it with English, but the French name is Thales, so that's just how I've got in the habit of saying it. So this is the case study I wanted to run through with you. You'll know about some of it because the second part of it came in the media. This procurement is a very strong example of undue influence and state capture. And so I just wanted to talk about this. It's about how the company came from literally nowhere, not even on the start line, nowhere, to win this $1.3 billion contract is a complex and highly political story that beggars belief, frankly. It contains many elements of undue influence that occupy my mind and pop up across other procurements. And here they all are in one story. So it's a really great example to give you. It also shows very starkly how industry bent both sides of politics to its will, which is that state capture definition we put up earlier from the World Bank. So Thales manufactures the Bushmaster, the medium-weight armoured vehicle, and it really desperately wanted to design and manufacture the Army's lighter-weight vehicle as well. This project originated under the Howard government in 2006, ran the length of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments, and the contract was finally signed at the crossover of the Abbott and Turnbull governments. So the procurement's still going on. That was just a 9-year process to get to the contract being signed. Designing and building a very small number of vehicles, it's only 1,100 from scratch, was considered too risky and expensive. So Defence had decided to partner with the USA and buy a vehicle, a similar one that the US was developing at the time. And that process started. And as I said, Thales was nowhere in the picture. So here's a summary of what happened. I'll try and be fast and stick to my time, Sue. So in that process then, so the Howard government started that. Then the government changed from coalition to Labor. We had Kevin 07. Thales at that point, some point after that, started extensive industry lobbying. This, I'm quoting the Australian National Audit Office, who I honour for the report it did on this because it's really mind-blowing. So it started extensive industry lobbying to get an Australian-made vehicle on the list of options. Its big point was that its Bendigo factory would run out of work when the Bushmaster vehicle ran out of production, putting jobs at risk, it claimed. So Labor's Defence Minister then, Joel Fitzgibbon, was persuaded by Thales, and he publicly announced he was adding an Australian-built option to the procurement without gaining Prime Minister Rudd's approval before he said so. Defence had commissioned an economic study, however, that found there would be limited regional economic benefits to keeping the factory open, that a significant price premium would be paid, and that most of Thales's profits would disappear offshore. Defence didn't share the study with the government. Defence recommended Defence recommended buying an extra 214 Bushmaster vehicles from Thales, admitting it had little need for them, just so that Thales could keep its factory open while waiting to see if it won the contract. 4 government departments opposed that plan: Prime Minister and Cabinet, Treasury, Finance and Foreign Affairs and Trade, yet the purchase went ahead, costing taxpayers $221 million. Treasury asked that that be included in further costings in the future, and it wasn't. Closing and reopening the factory would have cost $33 million. After this, and I'm summarising, if you're a research geek like me, I really suggest reading this report from the ANAO because it's amazing. So I'm picking out the big points. After this, Defence made 2 moves that ensured it had zero leverage for negotiating price with Thales. First of all, it dropped its involvement in the US vehicle that was still being held as a fallback position. So it pulled out of that. And then it sought and got government approval for the Thales vehicle before the negotiations with Thales had been completed. So that's a good way to remove all your leverage on price, by locking it in before the negotiations finished. The government had by now changed back to the coalition, and this next bit isn't in the ANAO report. It's just a few dots that I joined up. So while Thales was desperately trying to lock in this $1.3 billion contract, it approached former Defence Minister Brendan Nelson to join its advisory board. Brendan Nelson was then employed full-time as the director of the Australian War Memorial. In order to be able to do this, he required his minister's permission to take up that appointment, and he was given it. That was all kept secret at the time. So Nelson joined the Thales Advisory Board on the 17th March 2015. We know that because when the foreign interference legislation came out, you might remember Brendan Nelson was one of the first people to put his association with Thales on the record. So that's where these dates come from. It's unknown whether Dr. Nelson was involved in advising Thales about this procurement deal or maybe lobbying the government, don't know, but the timing certainly suggests the possibility. It was in August 2015, just 5 months after he joined the Thales Advisory Board, that the government approved the Hawkeye for acquisition. Now, you may have heard the next chapter of this saga because it did make a few headlines. In 2018, as the Audit Office was getting ready to publish its report about this procurement, Thales started pressuring the government and the Audit Office to censor the parts that made plain that the project did not represent value for taxpayers' money. They took the Audit Office to court. Attorney General Christian Porter ultimately overrode the Audit Office and used a dormant legal power to censor the parts of the report that Thales wanted censored. So that did get in the papers, just shocking. After a couple of years, thanks to the then Senator Rex Patrick and a very long freedom of information battle, the report was finally made fully public, and it revealed that Christian Porter had added the national security cloak simply to protect Thales' commercial interests. So there you have it. It's a big story. It's a big story of undue influence of one corporation over both parties, bending both political parties to its will against the public interest, and it fits right in with that World Bank definition of state capture we looked at the start. And as I said, it's not an isolated example, it's not the only example. If you want to read more about state capture, I contributed a lot of arms industry research to a report that came out at the start of the year. It's called Confronting State Capture, published by the Australian Democracy Network. It also looks at fossil fuels. So the two big industries globally, arms industry and fossil fuels in the state capture scenario, are in that document, and you can download it for free from Australian Democracy Network. Thank you for your attention, everybody.